Get out! You're the bad luck of this family, Lyle. My father didn't just scream it. He spat those words at me while I stood in a lethal Indiana blizzard, holding my 4-week-old daughter, Vesper, in my arms. For 20 years, they treated us like a contagious disease, until they saw my daughter's face on the cover of Forbes. Now they're at my front gate, begging for gratitude, and a seat at a table they spent 2 decades trying to burn down. But they forgot one thing. I kept the receipt for the soul they sold in the snow, and the interest has been compounding for 20 years. I stood in my Lake Forest study, the high-definition security feeds reflecting in my eyes, and for a second, the smell of my success vanished, replaced by the suffocating memory of a home that had already decided I was dead. The air inside the Oswald mansion didn't smell like family. It smelled of expensive cedar polish, imported pine, and the heavy, greasy scent of a roasted turkey that I knew I wouldn't be invited to taste. I stood in the foyer, my threadbare denim jacket stiff with frost, feeling the rhythmic, shallow warmth of Vesper's breath against my chest. She was only 4 weeks old, a tiny heartbeat muffled by a thin, fleece blanket that was losing its battle against the Indiana winter. The opulence of the room felt like a physical weight. Crystal chandeliers cast sharp, jagged light across the marble floor, while the distant chime of silverware and the polite laughter of Gary's elite drifted from the dining room. They were in there celebrating a legacy, while I was out here, standing in the shadows of the home that had raised me, feeling like a ghost haunting my own life. I looked down at Vesper, her small face tucked into the crook of my arm. Have you ever stood in a room full of people who share your blood and realized you were the only stranger there? It's a quiet kind of violence. My parents, Oswald and Beryl, were holding court, their voices projecting a carefully curated image of success. I realized then that to them, my daughter and I weren't kin. We were just stains on a pristine white carpet. I adjusted the edge of her blanket, shielding her from the draft. A man's true worth isn't measured by the square footage of the house he occupies, but by the depth of the peace he can protect for those who cannot protect themselves. At 29, I had no house, but I had a daughter, and that made me the richest man in a room full of paupers. The laughter died down as Oswald approached. He didn't walk toward me with the stride of a father. He moved like a landlord coming to collect a debt from a tenant he despised. He didn't look at Vesper. He didn't ask if she was healthy or if she was warm. He looked at my boots, tracking melted slush onto his floor, with a gaze that treated me like a contagious disease. "You're late, Lyle," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that lacked even a hint of holiday spirit. "And you're bringing that bad luck into this house again." I didn't flinch. I had learned a long time ago that family isn't always a safety net. Sometimes, it's just a jury that has reached a verdict before you even enter the room. Beryl stood a few paces behind him, her silence more lethal than his words. She adjusted her pearl necklace, her eyes scanning the foyer to ensure none of their guests could see us. "We warned you about that girl," she whispered, referring to the wife who had vanished 3 weeks ago. "Now you're left with the mess, and you expect us to clean it up. We have a reputation to protect, Lyle. We can't have the Vundane of the family dragging down your brother's promotion." She justified her cruelty as a necessity for the legacy. It was a cold, calculated legalism that prioritized social standing over the life of a newborn child. They weren't just asking me to leave, they were preparing to erase me. Oswald reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. He slapped it onto the antique mahogany side table with a hollow thud. "Sign it," he commanded. I looked down. It was a quitclaim deed and a waiver of heirship, legal documents prepared by the family attorney to strip me of any future claim to the Oswald estate or name. In exchange for my signature, I got nothing but the clothes on my back and the permission to walk away without being a burden. The air from the open doorway was sub-zero, turning our breath into gray plumes. My fingers were cracked and raw from the wind, the skin split at the knuckles. I reached for the pen, but the ink had frozen in the plastic barrel. Oswald sneered at my hesitation, mistake my shivering for weakness. "Still holding out for a handout? Sign it and get out." I didn't say a word. I didn't beg for a coat or a gallon of milk or a ride to a shelter. I looked at the signature line, then at my own hand. With a slow, deliberate motion, I pressed my cracked, bleeding thumb against the paper, leaving a dark crimson seal on the line where my name should have been. It wasn't just ink, it was a blood covenant. They thought they were taking my future, but they didn't realize they were just handing me my freedom. You cannot truly build a temple until you've cleared away the ruins of a prison. The massive oak door slammed shut behind us, the sound final and heavy, like a gavel hitting a bench in a high-stakes courtroom. I stood on the porch, the wind howling at 40 miles per hour, whipping snow into my eyes. The lights of the mansion began to dim as the party moved to the back of the house, leaving me in the great white silence of Gary. I had no car, no money, and a 4-week-old infant who was starting to stir against my chest. I looked at the distant, orange glow of the industrial district. Most people would have panicked, but I felt a strange, chilling clarity. I had been erased from their ledger, but the ink I left behind was permanent. I tucked Vesper deeper into my jacket, the warmth of my own body being the only thing keeping her alive. "They call us bad luck, little star," I whispered into the wind, my voice steady despite the cold. "But luck is for people who don't have a plan. We have the truth, and that's a weapon they haven't learned how to lock away yet." I started walking, my boots sinking 6 inches into the fresh powder with every step. The mansion grew smaller in the distance, a tomb of glass and gold that I was finally done guarding. I didn't know where we would sleep, but I knew we wouldn't be sleeping under their shadow ever again. Looking back now, I realized that was the moment my life actually began. I struggled through the drifts for blocks, my legs burning and my lungs screaming from the icy air. Just as the numbness began to take over my limbs, I spotted something. Down a narrow alleyway near the old railway tracks, a dim, flickering yellow light escaped from the frosted windows of a dilapidated woodshop. It was the only sign of life in a world that had turned to ice. I stared at that flickering light, wondering if it was a sanctuary or just another place to be turned away. The frozen air bit into my lungs as I stumbled toward that flickering yellow warmth. Vesper felt like a leaden weight against my chest, her tiny whimpers muffled by the wind. I didn't have a plan beyond the next 10 steps. I just knew that the ice was winning, and my daughter couldn't afford to lose. I reached the heavy timber door of the wood shop and leaned my forehead against the frosted wood, my breath hitching in a jagged sob I refused to let out. Before I could even find the strength to knock, the door creaked open. Silas stood there, framed by a halo of warm light and the scent of aged cedar. His face was a map of forgotten wars and decades of hard labor, his eyes settling on my shivering frame with a stillness that was unnerving. He didn't ask for my name or a life story. He didn't ask why a man in a threadbare jacket was holding a newborn in a blizzard at midnight. Silas looked at Vesper, then at my bloody split thumb, the one I'd used to sign away my existence, and simply stepped aside. Kindness in its purest form doesn't need a questionnaire. It just needs an open door. I shuffled inside, the heat from a pot-bellied stove hitting me like a physical blow. The shop was a sanctuary of order. Sharp tools lined the walls, and the floor was swept clean of everything but the faintest dusting of fresh sawdust. I realized then that I hadn't stumbled into a charity. I had found a master. A man isn't defined by the fall he takes, but by the hands that help him stand when the world wants him to crawl. Silas pointed toward a crate filled with clean cedar shavings. "Put her there," he said, his voice like the low rumble of a distant freight train. I laid Vesper down gently, her tiny hands uncurling as the warmth began to thaw her skin. I expected questions, or perhaps a lecture on the folly of my youth. Instead, Silas walked to a workbench and picked up a dull, rusted axe. He handed it to me, the hickory handle cold and rough against my raw palms. He pointed toward a pile of frozen oak logs near the back entrance. "The stove is hungry," he muttered, "and so are you. Work first. Talk is for people with full bellies and warm beds." I gripped the axe, my knuckles whitening, feeling the weight of the steel and the desperation in my gut. As I began to swing, the rhythmic thud of the blade meeting the frozen wood became the only sound in the world. I expected Silas to offer pity, or at least a word of encouragement. Instead, he sat at his bench, sharpening a chisel with clinical precision. "I knew Oswald 30 years ago," Silas said suddenly, the name hitting me harder than the cold. "I was the one who built the original oak doors for that mansion of his, the same ones that just slammed on your heels." My hands faltered for a second, the shock vibrating up my arms. Silas chose the black sheep over the Titan, providing a sanctuary that was also a trial. He knew the rot behind the Oswald name before I was even born. The physical pain of the labor began to transform into a strange mental clarity. Have you ever worked until your muscles screamed, just to quiet the noise in your head? With every log I split, I felt the anger of the night before being hammered into something useful. I whispered to Vesper as she slept in her bed of sawdust. They told me I was bad luck, little star. But luck is just a shadow. Steel only becomes a blade after it survives the fire and the hammer. The sawdust wasn't waste. It was the remains of something old being shaped into something new. I wasn't just splitting wood. I was breaking the hold my parents had on my identity. Silas watched me from the shadows, his nod the only approval I needed. Weeks bled into months, and the Gary winter slowly began to loosen its grip. My movements in the shop became precise, almost surgical. Silas taught me more than just joinery. He taught me the language of locks and wood. He showed me how to find the weak point in any structure, whether it was a mortise and tenon joint or a man's overinflated ego. I spent my days working the wood and my nights studying the mechanics of security. Vesper grew, her first smiles directed at the man who had saved us. Silas often watched me carve small, perfect wooden toys for her. A bird, a horse, a miniature shield. He noticed that I never spoke a word of malice against Oswald or Beryl, despite the scars they'd left. "You have a lot of reasons to hate them, Lyle," Silas remarked one evening, as the sun dipped below the industrial skyline. I didn't look up from the chisel I was honing. "Hating them takes energy I need for her," I replied, nodding toward Vesper. "I don't want to be the man who won a fight with his past. I want to be the father she never has to be ashamed of." Silence isn't an absence of noise, it's a presence of mind. I wasn't hiding in that shop. I was fortifying my soul. Looking back, I should have seen that this period of quiet was just the calm before the truth began to emerge. One rainy Tuesday, while I was cleaning out a stack of old blueprints Silas had kept in the back office, I felt a loose floorboard. Beneath it sat a metal box, rusted at the hinges. Inside wasn't money or jewelry. It was a hidden ledger, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. As I turned the pages, my breath caught. It was a record of Oswald's first construction contracts from 3 decades ago, unveiling a systematic trail of fraudulent materials and stolen ink. The legacy my father was so desperate to protect was built on a foundation of sand. I held the ledger, realizing that the key I had spent years forging was finally about to open a door they never thought I'd reach. The weight of the ledger felt like cold marble against my palms as I tucked it into the hidden compartment of my work bag. 2 years had passed since the night the Indiana blizzard tried to swallow me whole. And in that time, I had learned that the only thing more dangerous than a man with nothing is a man who has quietly rebuilt himself from the scrap heap. I have moved Vesper and myself into a modest apartment in a working-class neighborhood. A place where the neighbors didn't care about your last name, as long as you kept your lawn mowed and your noise down. I was no longer just Lyle, the bad luck son. I was a man with a trade, a patent pending, and a daughter who was the only son in my universe. I was in the middle of preparing Vesper's lunch when a sharp, authoritative knock echoed through the small hallway. It wasn't the rhythmic tapping of Silas or the neighborly rap of the mailman. It was the sound of someone who believed they owned the air you breathed. I walked to the door, my heart hammering a warning against my ribs. Looking through the peephole, my blood turned to slush. A woman in a sharp navy blazer held a clipboard, flanked by a police officer whose hand rested far too casually on his belt. I recognized that look, predatory concern wrapped in government bureaucracy. I knew exactly who had sent them. "Mr. Oswald, this is Officer Miller with Child Protective Services," the woman called out, her voice loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "We've received a serious report regarding the welfare of your daughter. Open up." I stood frozen for a heartbeat. My mind raced through every interaction, every doctor's visit, every gallon of milk I'd bought. The report was anonymous, but as she began to read the allegations, neglect, lack of a stable environment, suspected substance abuse, I felt a cold, familiar hand tightening around my throat. The details were too specific to be random, yet entirely fabricated. They cited medical records only a family member could have accessed through old insurance ties. This was Beryl's final play. She didn't want the child. She wanted to break the man who dared to survive without her. Instead of panicking, I let my locksmith training take over. I reached up and quietly secured the internal deadbolt I'd installed myself. A custom piece with a frictionless throw. I wasn't hiding. I was buying time. I pulled out my phone and dialed the legal aid attorney Silas had helped me retain months ago, all while keeping my voice as steady as the grain in an oak plank. "I am not denying you entry, officer," I said through the door, my tone clinical and devoid of the fear they expected. "However, under the Fourth Amendment, I am requesting that my counsel be present to witness the inspection of a clean, safe home. I have an immaculate home care log and a child who is currently sleeping. I suggest we wait. A wolf doesn't scream when the trap snaps, it calculates the release. Vesper toddled over, sensing the tension, and clutched my pant leg with her small, sticky hand. I knelt down, pressing my forehead against hers, shielding her from the muffled shouting on the other side of the wood. "The world is loud, little star," I whispered, my voice a low hum intended to soothe. "But this door is quiet. Daddy is here." Protection isn't just about building thick walls. It's about the truth you stand on when everyone else is trying to bury you in lies. I felt a surge of parental ferocity that surpassed anything I'd ever felt for myself. They had kicked me out, and I had stayed silent. They had erased my name, and I had worked. But they had come for my daughter, and that was the moment I realized the good son was truly dead. The standoff lasted 2 hours. By the time my attorney arrived, I had my binders ready, every receipt for organic formula, every immunization record, every photo of Vesper laughing in Silas's shop. When I finally opened the door, the CPS officer's face fell as she stepped into a home that smelled of lavender and fresh bread. There was no rot here, only the painstaking order of a man who knew he was being watched. After they left, frustrated and empty-handed, the silence that followed was heavier than the noise. I sat on the floor, watching Vesper play with a set of wooden blocks Silas had carved. Looking back now, I should have known that the assault on my home was just the opening salvo. A week later, the air felt thick with a different kind of tension. I was at an upscale organic supermarket across town, the kind of place my parents frequented, specifically to find a particular brand of berries Vesper loved. I was wearing my work uniform, clean, pressed, but unmistakably the attire of a man who worked with his hands. As I rounded the corner of the produce aisle, the universe decided to test my resolve. Beryl stood there, surrounded by her socialite circle, draped in silk and smelling of expensive lilies. Our eyes met, and for a second, the world went gray. She didn't gasp. She didn't offer a mother's greeting. She looked through me as if I were a pane of dirty glass, a smudge on the lens of her perfect life. When one of her friends leaned in and whispered, "Beryl, dear, do you know this man? He's staring quite intensely." Beryl's lips curled into a thin, cruel smile. "He's just a local contractor we had to let go for poor performance," she said, her voice dripping with practiced disdain. "Some people are simply not built for high-quality work." She treated her own flesh and blood like a failed service provider. The woman who had carried me for 9 months had just dismantled my existence in 5 seconds for the sake of a grocery store audience. I felt the heat rise in my neck, the old bad luck Lyle wanting to scream at the injustice. But then I looked at my hands, calloused, strong, and capable of creating things that would last a century. I looked at her, brittle, hollow, and terrified of a world where appearances didn't matter. I didn't cause a scene. I didn't shout. I simply reached down and picked up a silk scarf that had slipped from her designer bag onto the floor. I stepped forward, into her personal space, and handed it back with a steady hand. "You dropped this, ma'am," I said, my voice clear and resonant. "Be careful. Some things are too slippery to hold on to forever. Things like a clear conscience, or a son." The color drained from her face, her friends falling into a confused, awkward silence as I walked away without looking back. Back at the apartment that evening, Silas stopped by with a crate of cedar. I told him about the CPS visit and the supermarket. I showed him the digital archives I'd been building, every interaction, every receipt, every malicious report I had traced back to their IP addresses through a friend in IT. In this country, Silas, a pattern of malicious reporting isn't just a family feud, it's a legal liability, I said, pointing to the screen. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was building a legal moat around my daughter. If they wanted to play with the law, I would show them that I had learned to master the locks they thought only they held the keys to. Silas sipped his coffee, watching me with a mixture of pride and caution. "They want you to hate them, Lyle. That way you're still theirs. Hate is just another kind of bond." I shook my head, watching Vesper paint a messy, vibrant sun on a piece of scrap wood. "I don't hate them, Silas. I don't have the room for it. I don't forgive them because they deserve it. I forgive them so I don't have to carry their rot in my heart while I'm trying to raise her." The best way to show someone they were wrong about you isn't to tell them. It's to live a life that is so far above their reach that they have to strain their necks just to see your shadow. Have you ever felt the moment when the wind shifts? When you realize the storm is over and the tide is finally coming in? I sat at my small desk that night, the weight of the Chicago ledger still on my mind. Just as I was about to close my laptop, I heard the mail slot click. It was a certified letter, heavy and embossed. It wasn't a threat from my parents. It was from a top-tier intellectual property law firm in Chicago. They were representing a major defense contractor, and they were inquiring about a patent I'd filed months ago for a non-binary digital analog locking system. The offer at the bottom of the page had more zeros than I'd ever seen in my life. I stared at the letter, realizing that the key I had spent years forging in the dark was finally about to open a door they never even knew existed. The rain streaked across the floor-to-ceiling glass of my Chicago headquarters, blurring the city lights into a smear of cold neon. I sat in the silence of my office, a space defined by the soft, rhythmic hum of high-end security servers. For a long time, I simply stared at the Chicago skyline, reflecting on how far the industrial grid of Gary felt from this height. My life had become a series of calculated moves and silent victories, yet the past had a way of knocking when the weather turned foul. My assistant's voice crackled over the intercom, breaking the stillness. "Mr. Oswald, there's a man here to see you. A Julian Oswald. He says it's urgent family business." I didn't answer immediately. I felt the old tightness in my chest, the ghost of a younger, discarded Lyle wanting to flinch. But I wasn't that man anymore. I leaned back, my knuckles whitening as I gripped the leather armrests. "Send him in," I said, my voice as level as a horizon line. Julian walked in with the practiced swagger of a man who believed his own press releases. He was the golden son, the one my parents had protected at the cost of my dignity. He carried a bottle of 20-year-old single malt and a forced, charismatic smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Lyle, look at you," he gestured to the office. "We heard you were doing well, but this is world class." He poured 2 glasses without being asked, the liquid amber reflecting the dim office lights. He spoke of reconciliation and modernizing the family legacy, presenting a thick, leather-bound contract for a joint family venture. I didn't touch the whiskey. I scanned the document with the eyes of a forensic analyst, not a brother. A snake doesn't change its skin to be friendly, it does it to hide the age of its venom. As Julian droned on about unity, I looked at the digital photo of Vesper on my desk. She was 4 now, her eyes full of the light I had fought to keep alive. Julian hadn't even asked her name. Success without soul is just a well-decorated grave. They weren't looking for a brother, they were looking for a lifeline. "Lyle, Dad is getting older," Julian said, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. "He wants you back in the fold. He realizes he was perhaps too harsh." I flipped to the hidden cross-collateralization clause tucked away in the appendix. It was a predatory loan guarantee, a legal noose designed to tie my billion-dollar patents to my father's crumbling construction debts. Julian wasn't here to apologize. He was here to commit corporate identity theft against his own blood. I felt a somber kind of pity for him. He was still the same boy, playing games in a world that had moved on. Love is a bond, but business is a contract. He had confused the two, and I was about to show him that he now had neither. I didn't shout. I didn't throw him out. I simply slid a manila folder across the desk. Inside were records of Julian's own recent fraudulent wire transfers, desperate moves made to keep the family firm afloat. "In the eyes of the law, Julian, an intent to defraud is as heavy as the crime itself," I said, my tone clinical. "I won't be signing your contract, but I will give you 24 hours to resign from your position before this folder reaches the SEC. Julian's face turned the color of ash. He tried to speak, but the words died in his throat. Family ties are not a legal defense for grand larceny. I stood up, indicating the meeting was over. "You never understood," I said quietly. "You can't steal a legacy you never earned." After Julian fled into the rainy night, I met with my chief legal counsel in the war room. We pulled up the architecture of my invisible empire, a series of special-purpose vehicles I had spent 3 years using to buy up distressed debt on the secondary market. We scrolled through the tax liens, the equipment leases, and the primary mortgages for every major Oswald property in Indiana. The reality was cold and absolute. I didn't just have my own empire. I owned the very deed to my father's throne. I had spent 20 years being the bad luck son, while quietly becoming their largest creditor. Justice isn't always about taking what they have. It's about showing them they never truly had it in the first place. I called Silas as I watched the rain wash against the glass. I have the keys to their world now, Silas, I said, my voice heavy with the weight of the moment. There was a long pause on the other end. A man with all the keys must decide which doors are worth opening, Lyle, Silas replied, his voice a steady anchor, and which are better left locked forever. I looked at the flickering lights of Chicago and realized he was right. I didn't feel the rush of revenge I had once imagined. I felt the somber responsibility of a man who had built a fortress to keep the darkness out. Looking back now, I realized that the hardest part of power isn't gaining it. It's knowing when to use it for mercy and when to use it for truth. I headed home, the drive through the city a blur of reflection. I found Vesper in her room, surrounded by the wooden toys Silas had carved for her. I sat on the edge of her bed and read her a story about a hidden kingdom, her small hand clutching mine. I realized then that the greatest part of my empire wasn't the glass tower or the debt ledgers. It was the fact that my daughter slept in a house where the doors only opened for love, never for leverage. Have you ever felt the peace of a house where the past can no longer hurt you? It's a quiet kind of wealth that no bank can ever seize. As I tucked her in, my phone buzzed with a notification from the hidden camera feed I maintained at the old Gary estate. The image was grainy, illuminated by the harsh streetlights. Oswald and Beryl were frantically packing suitcases into the trunk of a car, their movements jerky and panicked. They looked small, broken by the weight of a storm they had spent decades brewing. They had no idea that the very house they were standing in, the one they had used to humiliate me, officially belonged to the son they had discarded. I watched the feed for a moment, knowing that the public storm was about to break over the family that thought they were untouchable. The morning sun over Chicago felt colder than usual, a stark contrast to the burning intensity of the digital storm brewing on my monitors. I stood in my office, watching the live feed of a local human interest talk show, my face a mask of stone. Oswald and Beryl were center stage, sitting on a plush sofa under the soft glow of studio lights. They looked fragile, dressed in clothes that suggested a dignified poverty they hadn't actually earned. Beryl dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, her voice trembling with a practiced, theatrical sorrow as she spoke to the host. "We just want to know why," she sobbed. "We gave him everything. And now that Lyle is a titan of industry, he leaves his own flesh and blood to rot in a house the bank is taking away. Is this what success looks like? Forgetting the ones who carried you?" The nen, the compression of the moment, was suffocating. My PR team was pacing the boardroom next door, their voices rising in a frantic chorus of damage control and emergency statements. Outside, the social media vacuum was filling with vitriol. People who didn't know the frost of a Gary winter were calling for a boycott of Vesper defense. They saw two elderly people in distress and a cold-hearted billionaire son. But I didn't panic. I've learned that a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its boots. Silence in the court of public opinion is often interpreted as guilt, but a calculated response is a surgical strike. I ignored the stock market dip and looked at Vesper, who was watching the screen with a terrifyingly calm clarity. "Don't be afraid of the noise, Vesper," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Be afraid of the silence of your own conscience." She looked at me, her eyes reflecting the neon lights of the city. At 20, she had the stoic resolve I'd spent a lifetime forging. She didn't ask me to fight. She simply picked up a leather-bound frame from my desk, the one containing the document I'd kept in a fireproof safe for 2 decades. "I'm not afraid, Dad," she said. "I'm ready." In that moment, I realized the greatest victory wasn't my empire. It was the fact that I had raised a woman who knew that truth doesn't need to scream to be heard. The studio host was just reaching the crescendo of his closing monologue, his face twisted in moral indignation. "A man who forgets his parents forgets his soul," he began, looking directly into the camera. Suddenly, the heavy soundstage doors swung open. The air in the room seemed to shift. It wasn't me who walked into the glare of the spotlights. It was Vesper. She moved with a radiant, quiet authority that silenced the audience. She didn't look at the cameras. She looked directly at the 2 people sitting on that sofa, the biological strangers who had tried to erase her father before she was even a month old. "You speak of gratitude," Vesper said, her voice resonant and clear through the studio microphones, "but you've forgotten the cost of your legacy." She stepped toward the coffee table and placed the framed document in front of the host. It was the original waiver of heirship and quitclaim deed from 20 years ago. The camera operators, sensing a massive shift, zoomed in on the yellowed paper. Vesper pointed to the dark brownish stain next to my signature, the crimson mark I'd left in the freezing Indiana wind. "This isn't just ink," she told the millions watching. "This is my father's blood. He signed away his entire existence to save mine, because you kicked a newborn child into a blizzard on Christmas Eve. Is this the gratitude you were looking for?" The silence that followed was absolute. The host's mouth hung open, his script forgotten. I watched the monitors as the smug masks Oswald and Beryl were wearing shattered into shards of pure, unadulterated terror. The destitute elders suddenly looked like what they were, predators caught in the light of their own lies. The victim narrative didn't just stumble, it disintegrated. Have you ever seen the exact moment a person realizes their past has finally caught up to them? It's not loud. It's the sound of a heart skipping a beat in a room full of people. They had spent 20 years setting a trap for me, but they hadn't realized that the truth is a door that only opens one way. The broadcast was cut to an emergency commercial break, but the damage was irreversible. As Vesper walked out of the studio, Oswald and Beryl were hounded by the very reporters they had invited to witness my shame. I met her at the stage door, pulling her into a silent, crushing embrace. The host ran out after us, stuttering about a right to respond and potential libel suits. I looked at him with a level of detachment that seemed to unnerve him. "Suing them would imply their words have value," I said quietly. "They are simply echoes of a past that no longer exists in this house." I had no intention of being a participant in their circus. I was the architect of my own boundaries. We walked toward the car, the city air feeling lighter. "You were brave today, little star," I told Vesper as I handed her a handkerchief to wipe a stray smudge of dust from her cheek. "But remember, the highest form of victory isn't winning an argument, it's having the peace to walk away from one. You cannot pour from an empty cup, and you certainly cannot build a relationship with people who only view you as an ATM for their mistakes." I didn't hate them. To hate them would be to acknowledge they still had power. I simply no longer recognized them as mine. I had been erased once. Now I was the one doing the erasing. As we drove onto the Lakeshore Drive, my phone pings with a desperate, frantic text from Oswald. "The bank is at the door, Lyle. They are seizing the Gary house as we speak. Please, we have nowhere to go. We are your family." I stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in my eyes. I thought about the snow in Gary. I thought about the bloody thumbprint. I didn't reply. I didn't call. I simply locked the screen and watched the dark water of Lake Michigan churn against the pier. I knew they were about to walk into the very trap they had spent 20 years setting for me, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one holding the door open. The raindrops drummed against the reinforced glass of my Lake Forest estate, a rhythmic metallic pulse that matched the ticking of the high-end security monitors in my study. I watched the pitch-black driveway through the infrared lenses of my exterior cameras. A set of headlights cut through the Indiana fog, low, desperate beams of a car that had seen better decades. Oswald and Beryl didn't knock. They didn't ring the bell. They moved with the frantic, jerky motions of thieves, using a master key Julian had likely provided in a final, pathetic act of betrayal. They thought they were infiltrating the private sanctuary of the bad luck son to find some scrap of leverage to stop the bank from seizing their lives. They had no idea they were walking into a fortress designed specifically to hold their ghosts. As they stepped into the foyer, the heavy industrial locks engaged with a thud that echoed like a hammer on an anvil. I watched Beryl's face on the monitor. Her eyes widened as she realized the door wasn't just closed, it was sealed. I felt a cold, clinical clarity as I observed them. They spent 20 years trying to lock me out of their world, treating me like a contagion to be quarantined. They never imagined I would spend those same 20 years building a world where they would be the ones begging for the key. I saw my mother's hands trembling as she fumbled with her purse, and for a fleeting, foolish second, a pang of sorrow hit me. Not for the woman she was, but for the mother I had deserved, the one who would have chosen her son over a hollow reputation. A father's job is to build a roof that never leaks and a door that never lies. I've done both, but the cost was losing the people who gave me my name. I didn't let them wander. I descended the grand staircase, my silhouette sharp and dark against the Lake Forest fog visible through the gallery windows. The lights in the grand hall flickered on, one by one, triggered by my proximity. Oswald and Beryl stood in the center of the room, looking small and brittle amidst the high ceilings. But it wasn't the architecture that froze them in place. It was the furniture. Surrounding them was their own past. Oswald's heavy antique mahogany desk, the family portraits that once hung in the Gary mansion, even Beryl's ornate vanity with its triptych mirror. They were standing in the middle of a graveyard of their own making. "Welcome home," I said, my voice echoing with a weight that seemed to press the oxygen out of the room. Oswald's face twisted into a mask of indignant rage. "Lyle, what is the meaning of this? Why is our furniture in your house? This is theft." I didn't raise my voice. I simply walked to the center table and laid out a series of bill of sale documents and certificate of title transfers. Under the law, Oswald, a house is just wood and stone, but a home is built on a foundation of integrity. Since you destroyed the latter, I simply bought the former at the public auctions your creditors held last month. I own their legacy now, piece by piece, purchased through the very SPVs they had tried to use to bankrupt me. Oswald lunged for a small silver trophy on the mantel, a relic of his younger, more successful years. I stopped him with a single, icy look. "You can't steal what you've already sold for the price of your pride," I said, my tone a flat line of moral authority. "You traded your son for a reputation you couldn't even keep. Now, you're standing in a room full of things that no longer belong to you, in a house owned by a man you no longer know. Have you ever realized that the people you were most afraid of were actually just hollow shells held together by the opinions of others? It's a tragic irony. They were so busy guarding the front door of their status that they never noticed I had bought the entire building from underneath them." The shadows near the library moved, and Silas stepped into the light. He was dressed in his Sunday best, a simple, pressed shirt that made him look like the true patriarch he was. I watched the color drain from Beryl's face as she recognized the man who had built her original mansion doors 30 years ago. "Oswald, Beryl," I said, gesturing toward Silas. "I'd like to introduce you to the man who actually raised the son you discarded. The man who taught me that a lock is only as strong as the man who stands behind it." Silas didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was a silent indictment of every failure they had ever committed. Vesper entered the hall then, standing shoulder to shoulder with Silas. She didn't look at her biological grandparents with hate. She looked at them with the cold, detached curiosity one might have for a piece of broken machinery that was no longer worth fixing. In that moment, I realized that Vesper's strength was my greatest achievement. She wasn't burdened by their rot because I had built a fortress of truth around her. I looked at my parents and felt the finality of the moment settle in my bones. "I didn't bring you here to watch you suffer," I told them. "I brought you here to show you that the bad luck you feared was actually the only thing that could have saved you. But you traded a lighthouse for a matchstick, and now the match is burned out." I reached into my pocket and pulled out an old, yellowed grocery receipt, the one Kendall had left on the crib 20 years ago. The shaky pen marks were faded, but the words were still a jagged scar. I placed it on the table next to a fresh legal notice. "One last thing before you leave," I said, my voice dropping to a level of quiet power that made the air feel heavy. "There is one last debt to settle, and this one doesn't involve banks or mortgages." I looked at the receipt, then at the two people who had let me walk into a blizzard without a coat. I saw the way the rain-slick glass reflected the lights of the hall, making the whole world look like it was made of cold, shimmering tears. I didn't know if they were capable of feeling the weight of what they had lost, but I knew I was done carrying it for them. I looked at the legal notice, and then at the door. The final closure wasn't about the millions of dollars in debt I had acquired. It was about the true cost of 20 years of silence. Looking back now, I realize I was never your bad luck, I whispered, more to myself than to them. I was your only chance, and you threw it away. The heavy, suffocating tension of the previous night had finally settled into a profound, absolute stillness. I stood in the center of the grand hall as the orange sun began its slow descent over Lake Michigan, casting long, peaceful shadows across the marble floor. Oswald and Beryl stood before me, surrounded by the literal ghosts of their own greed, their furniture, their portraits, the very relics of the life they thought they had secured by discarding me. They looked remarkably small now, like withered leaves caught in a draft. The loudest thing in this room wasn't the sound of my breathing. It was the 20 years of silence they had left behind. I wasn't here to finish a fight or to deliver a monologue of vengeance. I was here to close a book that had been open for far too long. I reached into my blazer and pulled out a plain white envelope, sliding it across the polished mahogany table toward my father. I didn't offer a lecture or a scream. I offered a mirror, I have no interest in being your jailer, I said, my voice steady and clear, reflecting the calm of the water outside. To keep you here as debtors would mean keeping you in my heart, and I have worked too hard to build a garden where your thorns cannot reach. I glanced toward the corner of the room, where Silas was quietly brewing tea, the scent of cedar and peppermint grounding the moment. Blood makes you related, Lyle, but loyalty makes you family. I had realized long ago that a name is just a label. It's the hands that hold you in the dark that define your home. Oswald took the envelope with trembling fingers. He expected a lawsuit, a restraining order, or perhaps a final demand for the keys to their dignity. Instead, his eyes widened as he pulled out a multi-page itemized invoice. It was a meticulous accounting of a forsaken life. Every gallon of milk I'd bought with nickels found in the snow, every box of pull-ups Vesper had worn, every medical bill from the clinic in Gary, and every hour of childcare I had to navigate alone while they refused responsibility. The total at the bottom was in the millions, a figure that represented the literal cost of their abandonment. But across the entire document, in bold black ink, I had stamped the words, "Paid in full." Beneath the stamp, I had added a simple, handwritten note, "Settled by the son you called bad luck." I explained to them the legal weight of that document. In accordance with the accord and satisfaction principle of U.S. law, by accepting the release from the debts I had purchased from their creditors, they were legally acknowledging the absolute severance of any future claims. No more demands for gratitude, no more claims of familial support. I had used the law to build a permanent, impenetrable wall between their toxicity and my daughter's future. I paid these debts not for you, but for Vesper, I said, looking Oswald directly in the eyes. I wanted her to know that her life was never a burden I couldn't carry. You owe me nothing, because I've decided you are worth nothing to our tomorrow. Beryl tried to speak, her lips quivering, but the words died in the sterile air of the hall. True forgiveness isn't saying what someone did was okay. It's simply refusing to let their rot live in your soul any longer. I was choosing peace over the poison of their presence. I watched them realize that there was no room left for negotiation or manipulation. The game was over. They turned and walked toward the grand doors, the same doors I had forged with the precision Silas had hammered into my soul. As they reached the gate, they found that their car had been towed for trespassing. They would have to walk the long, winding road back to the city, just as I had once walked into the blizzard. The cinematic wide angle of the dusk-lit estate seemed to capture the finality of their departure. Silas, Vesper, and I stood on the terrace, watching the silhouettes of my biological parents fade into the growing darkness. There was no celebration, no cheers of victory, just the quiet, heavy satisfaction of a job well done. The best revenge isn't a strike. It's a life so well lived that the people who hurt you can no longer even see your shadow. Vesper leaned her head on my shoulder, her hand clutching mine. "Is it over, Dad?" she whispered. I took a deep breath of the cold lake air. "It's not just over, Vesper." It settled. I picked up the old, dented green thermos Silas had handed me 20 years ago, the one that had held the coffee that kept me awake through the night shifts and the long, lonely vigils over a sleeping infant. I looked at my daughter, the girl who was once called Bad Luck and who is now the very sun of my world. We are the architects of our own light, and tonight the house was finally quiet. Looking back at the flickering lights of the city in the distance, I knew I had finally found the peace that no bank could seize and no parent could grant. I was never their bad luck. I was their only chance. And I was finally free enough to let them go. To those of you watching and listening, I know many of you have stood in that cold foyer. I know you've felt the weight of being erased by the people who were supposed to be your sanctuary. Have you ever had to choose between a toxic history and a peaceful future? How did you find the strength to walk away? Tell me your story in the comments. I read every one, because I know that sometimes the only thing that gets us through the blizzard is knowing we aren't walking through it alone. I watched them disappear into the dusk, knowing that the only key I needed now was the one that opened the door to tomorrow.